Howdy, folks. This is Big Sam. Today, we're going to take a look at the oldest video that I can possibly find to feature the Mosin Nagant. Now, how old do you think this video is? Maybe the 1930s? Maybe the 1940s? Maybe just after World War I even? Actually, none of the above. You see, this movie was actually made in 1911. Now, you might ask, well, what kind of a movie is it? Well, it's not a particularly long one. It's kind of long. It's certainly going to be longer than this video, but it's actually a silent movie, as you could probably imagine. Most movies back then were silent movies. Now, 1911 is kind of an interesting year because this is still the Russian Empire we're talking about here. This is pre-World War I. And we think of the Russian Empire before World War I here in the West as sort of a kind of a rudimentary country, a lot of just farmers, and not a lot of interesting technology. But that's not really that accurate. They were doing a lot of interesting things. One of them was making silent films. Now, what was this movie about? Well, the title of it is The Siege of Sevastopol. And what's fantastic about this movie is not only does it still exist, it's actually on YouTube. I will be putting a link down in the description where you can watch this whole movie for yourself. Again, it's very old. At the making of this video, it's 110 years old. So, I don't know if you want to tell your friends when they ask you, what do you do for fun? You can say, I watch 110-year-old movies filled in Imperial Russia featuring Mosin-Nagants. They might think you're weird. And you know what? You probably are weird if you do that, because I'm weird. But anyway, getting back to our story today, what war is this movie about? Because we said it's called the Battle of Sevastopol, or the Siege of Sevastopol. That also is sort of ambiguous because there were several sieges at Sevastopol. Well, there was one in World War II, but World War II wasn't a thing in 1911. This movie is actually about the Crimean War. Now, at this point in time, you might be asking, well, when was the Crimean War? Some of you actually already know this answer. It was around 1854. All right. Now, I'm going to get a lot of backlash from people saying, well, Big Sam, there were no Mosin-Nagants in 1854, not even early prototypes. And you are correct. You see, in 1854, the Russian army was actually still using basically almost entirely flintlock smoothbore muskets. So why is there a Mosin-Nagant in this film? Well, there's another good question. And I think it really lends to the fact that the Russians probably didn't have a ton of muskets lying around. Even back then, they were probably pretty rare because those things were used until they were pretty much worthless. And then, this is a common theme in the Russian Empire. It's one of the reasons, in fact, why guns from the old Russian Empire are actually extremely rare today, is because they were all used, and then when Russia was done with them, they either destroyed them, converted them into shotguns for peasants, or sold them off to somebody else that used them until they were worthless, or they were captured and somehow made it to the Khyber Pass in Afghanistan, and they were used until they just became worthless. So it's really interesting to look at that aspect of history and to apply it in this instance. So that is my guess as to why we're not seeing percussion muskets, or not even percussion muskets, flintlock muskets in this film. They probably used what they had access to. What they had access to was the M91 Mosin-Nagant. Now, what's really interesting about this film is as you watch it, they don't even make an attempt to make people think that they're shooting flintlock rifles. You'll actually see troops with Mosin-Nagants physically actuating the bolt. And I find that rather strange because the quality of the film is so poor that if people didn't know any better or really familiar with the way guns look, they wouldn't even pay attention because it's kind of hard to see. Okay? It's very grainy, and it's 110 years old. I mean, you can't have very high standards for film quality for a film that old. All right? So, that's fine. But even despite that, they still didn't make an attempt to sort of conceal the fact that they're using Mosin Nagants instead of actual muskets, which I find very interesting. I think they were more focused on the fact that, wow, we're actually just making a movie in 1911. So I'm not going to fault them. This is a very early film. I'm just glad that it exists at all in the first place. But to understand this video a little bit better, we have to go back to what is the Crimean War? Well, to understand the Crimean War, we first have to kind of understand the Great Schism of 1054. Now, that's going to lead us into an entire rabbit hole that we don't need to get into in this video. But just know this, the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church didn't really like each other, and they didn't really get along. And this would go on for centuries. Even today, they don't particularly like each other, right? And that's just the way things are. Well, if we go back to around the early 1850s, we start to see a lot of tension. And the focus of this tension is the declining Ottoman Empire. And they were really in decline, especially in the second half of the 19th century, and ultimately met their demise after World War I. But as they were declining, France in the early 1850s, France decided that the Catholic Church, because France is Catholic, has control and authority over all of the churches and holy sites in the Holy Land area. Well, as you can imagine, the Eastern Orthodox Church wasn't very happy about this because they thought they had dominion over all the churches and holy sites in the Holy Land. So there were some tensions back and forth, and both of them were sort of, hey, Turkey, give us control. And sort of Turkey was put in a really terrible spot, a spot they couldn't really win. Whoever they give control to, the Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church, they're simply going to make the other one very mad. So at this point, it sort of seemed like war was inevitable. So eventually the Ottoman Empire said, well, we're going to declare that the Catholic Church has authority over the holy sites and churches in the Holy Land area. And that's fine. And then the Russians invaded. So they invaded the Balkans because, well, they weren't really happy about this, and they sort of looked at this as a good opportunity with the Ottoman Empire declining to take a lot of this territory and to expand into this whole region. The Russian Empire was especially keen on securing the warm water ports of the Black Sea. That would actually give them access to a really good jumping off point to go even maybe invade the Holy Land if they wanted to. Because you can actually, if you're in the Black Sea, you can actually sail through the strait right next to Istanbul. You can go through all the way to the Aegean Sea, then to the Mediterranean Sea, and ultimately land your troops about almost probably, I looked on a map, it seems to be about within 60 kilometers of Jerusalem. So the Black Sea is an extremely important port. Remember, it's also warm water. The other ports north, places like Archangel, in the Baltic Sea, that's all very cold, and it's just a whole different thing, right? You can't really get access to the Holy Land from there. So there was a lot in it for Russia, so they invaded. Well, this gets interesting because Austria was actually their ally, but they kept remaining neutral, which is very strange because Russia was one of their greatest allies. Now, Britain and France really weren't happy about this. Eventually, they would declare war on Russia, and they would actually invade the Crimea. Now, the Crimea is a really important place because that's where we have a really famous port city on the Black Sea known as Sevastopol, the same one that's in our video today. Well, this was sort of an issue. They had a lot of logistical problems here, but going back to Austria, they kept trying to sort of act like the United Nations and say, well, we can fix all the world's problems with diplomacy. And it sounds great, it just doesn't work. And that's what happened here. Austria was neutral the whole time, and they kept trying to get everyone together to say, hey, let's settle this out. And it just didn't happen. So eventually we have this invasion of the Crimea by the British and the French. And what's interesting here is the Russians had a severe technological disadvantage because, as I stated earlier, almost all of their weapons were flintlock muskets, smoothbore, no rifling, not super accurate guns, right? They're not even really designed to aim. You just sort of point and shoot, right? It's over there, okay, fire. Well, all the British had mostly percussion rifled muskets, which is fantastic, much better than what the Russians had. So a lot of people just sort of say, well, the Russians were technologically disadvantaged, and from that aspect, they absolutely were. But what's interesting is the Russians, for the first time in world history that we're aware of, used exploding cannon shells against the Ottoman fleet, which is really interesting. So even though it was the technologically disadvantaged Russians to do that, so, there's a little bit of interesting history there for sure. Well, the French and the Brits, they had a lot of logistical problems, which is funny. They didn't have any sort of way or tools to unload their ships once they landed, so they had to actually steal a bunch of wagons from the surrounding Tartar peoples, and all sorts of weird things like that happened that we don't have to get into today. But you also remember a famous charge named the Charge of the Light Brigade. Well, that was a very foolish British cavalry charge, and they basically charged next to and at Russian artillery, and like a third of them, something like that, died. It wasn't good. Both sides, honestly, had a lot of issues and just had a lot of incompetence associated with them. It's a really unfortunate war and sort of pointless. But that's happened a lot in history, and it seems like we never learned from it, which is unfortunate. Well, Sevastopol was besieged, and eventually it fell. The Russians would hold out for quite a while, though, but that is really what this video is about. So maybe that gives you a little bit of backstory. And what's great is through this video, we've been able to connect the history of the Mosin Nagant to the Great Schism of 1054 through a silent movie made in 1911. Now, if that's not interesting history for you, I don't know what is. So again, the link to the video is going to be in the description if you'd like to watch it for yourself. It's really interesting. And again, this picture we're looking at here, you can probably see it. There's actually a Mosin Nagant. So this is probably the first image that I found of any time a Mosin Nagant was used on any sort of film. Very interesting. See, you learn really useful things watching this channel, don't you? Well, hopefully. Anyway, I appreciate y'all watching, and hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you do and you like more Mosin Nagant content, please consider subscribing. Let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and I'll see you next time.